Hello, it is New Year's Day 2025. So, first of all, Happy New Year's to you. Because it's a holiday, I'm actually going to honor that and take it off. So, I'm going to re air an episode from June 6th, 2024 on Saturn. And this has to do with the medical astrology series that we are about in the middle of because Saturn rules chronic illnesses and cold and a lot of things that end up being boundaries or stiffness. So we will definitely dive more into that. So it's a good time to refresh knowledge on Saturn. The other thing to be aware of is I'm sure you've heard there's a lot happening in 2025 with all of the planets and all of the outer planets change sign. Saturn is really the last one that is visible without a telescope, and for a long time represented boundaries because of that. So, on Saturn has been in Pisces for the last couple years and will be moving into the sign of Aries, a very, very different energy than Pisces, on May 25th, 2025. However, Saturn's going to turn around and do a retrograde before it even reaches 2 degrees of Aries. And it's going to go back for quite a long time until November 28th of 2025. So that's quite a long retrograde period, where I'm sure I'll do an episode on that. I'm sure we're being asked to focus on something serious there. So then it'll start moving forward again once it reaches 25 degrees Pisces on November 28th. So, those of you who are in your Saturn return because you have Saturn in Pisces, you won't be quite done yet. And those of you who have Saturn in Aries, especially at those early degrees, you're definitely feeling it now. With that, I again welcome in 2025 with you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hello, and welcome to Conscious Curiosities, where we unlock the wisdom of the universe that lies within us. I'm your host, Maria Luz, certified hypnotist, astrologer, and developing psychic medium. Today's episode is entitled Saturn, Not Just an Asshole Trying to Ruin Your Life. And in this episode, we explore the following: Saturn context. I'll go into the mythology and the astronomy briefly, and then the astrological associations with Saturn. And then we will go in what Saturn is really asking of us and what we need to be aware of when those key transits are happening or when looking at your natal chart and Saturn. And yeah, just a behind the scenes, I have been feeling this Gemini energy, and I think it's for a lot of reasons, but one theory is that June is kind of like December. It's kind of like the kickoff of the holiday season. So people are already kind of overcommitting themselves, and I am no exception. And so, yeah, the other thing is just I also don't really know what I'm doing. Sorry just to burst your bubble. But like with this podcast, I just kind of did my Aries moon thing and jumped in. And so I've been teaching myself how to do that. And I would love your feedback. I can take it. I am a grown ass woman. In fact, my youngest is graduating from college this Sunday. So if you have any input, I welcome that always. And you can send it to info@marialuz.online. The other thing I keep forgetting to say is that my older son, Gianni Aiello, created the intro and the outro music for me. I had no idea what to do, but he created that. And additionally, he created those beats that are behind my recent hypnotic tracks, which I think are just so cool and really help us get into a deeper state of hypnosis. And he released an album called Live at the Space Bar, which I think is so clever because, computer space bar, but also space because I love astrology. And that's under the name Animal Camera with 2 eyes. And you can find that at Bandcamp and in the show notes. That was just a little Gemini detour, which is so fitting. But back to the topic, which is Saturn. And I thought I would talk about it this week because one planet after another in Gemini will be facing Saturn in this kind of challenging aspect, which is a square. And then later this month on June 29th, Saturn turns retrograde. Saturn's going to remain retrograde until November 15th. So just so you know, the outer planets, which are Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they do go retrograde once a year for a pretty long time period, 120 to 160 days. They just get less press because Mercury goes retrograde 3 times a year and just seems to, wreak havoc because of its trickster energy. And then, because of that trickster aspect, there seem to be more just communication and tech and travel snafus. As an aside, Saturn will enter Aries, which is a huge thing, Saturn changing signs. And it enters Aries May 24th on 2025. So if you want to mark your calendars now, you are welcome. But I will remind all of us as we get closer. So for now, when I speak about current transits involving Saturn, just know that it is in the sign of Pisces. So for the mythology, Saturn is also known as Kronos in Greek mythology, and he was the king of the Titans and the god of time. He, not so pleasantly, castrated and killed his father, Uranos, which is also known as Uranus, who was the god of the sky. And so immediately we're getting into this kind of father theme. And he's also known for eating his children right after they were born from the mother, Rhea, because he feared that this prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him would come true, which it eventually did because Rhea finally managed to secret the baby Zeus away to Crete, and then she wrapped up a stone in some swaddling and gave it to Kronos, and he ate it thinking that he was eating baby Zeus. But when Zeus grew up, he forced Kronos to regurgitate all of Zeus's siblings, and then they all became the gods of Mount Olympus that we know, and they waged war against the dad, Saturn or Kronos, and his gang, the Titans, and the Olympians defeated them. So that's just a brief summary of the mythology, and I'll put the link, of course, in the show notes if you want to read more. And the astronomy, Saturn is the 6th planet from the sun and the 2nd largest in the solar system. And it's one of the gas giants that we know and love, those big outer planets. And 9 Earths would almost span Saturn's diameter. So that's just to give you an idea of how much larger it is. And its orbit is 29 Earth years, which will be significant later when we talk about Saturn returns. And the atmosphere is almost all hydrogen and helium. And it's the farthest discovered by the unaided human eye. So that's why, again, when we get into the astrology, it's known for restriction because it was kind of the boundary for what we could see before telescopes were invented. And it has 146 moons. And also NASA is sending this thing called a rotocraft. And the name of that rotocraft is Dragonfly to one of Saturn's moons, which strangely, is called Titan. So the gang that he was in. And it's thought to have some prebiotic chemical processes that are common to early Earth. And because it's so far, it's supposed to arrive there in about 10 years. Yeah, 2034. On to the astrology. So Saturn is the planetary ruler of Capricorn, and in Hellenistic astrology, also the ruler of Aquarius. And it's associated with those Capricornian, 10th house themes, which are reputation, legacy, vocation, and sometimes that 10th house is also associated with the father or the parent who was in the father-like role. And just a reminder that when we're thinking about planets and signs and houses, the planet really is the noun. So it's the one who wants or does the thing. And then the sign is more the adverb and how the thing is wanted or done. And then the house is the area of life. I mean, of course, with all things astrology, it's more nuanced than that. But just to have a basic framework, I think that's useful. And then I've also just started learning a bit about medical astrology as part of my herbalist program. And I thought it would be interesting to share some of the correspondences of Saturn. And each planet has its own correspondences. And so for Saturn, those are lead, minerals, heavy metals, bones, ligaments, tendons, cartilage, cuticles, the nails ruled by Jupiter, the teeth, and hearing. Hearing is co-ruled by Mars, Mercury, and Taurus, and Aries. And I would love to go off on a tangent there, but I'll try not to. But just so you know, like the hearing, because it's both like mental and it's the ears. That's why it has so many different associations there. But also Saturn, along with Capricorn, rules the knees and mental focus and the general stability of systems and rhythms, and then larger cycles like the onset and end of menstruation. So given all that, we have associations of Saturn and Capricorn with aging and all of the things that go along with it. So in my mind, those are things like responsibility, maturity, discipline, time passing, experience, money, status, patience, effort, accomplishment, goals, and standards. And you can see that when Saturn becomes too strong with, any of those things, it could feel restrictive or just simply like too much pressure and stress. And it can lead to other Saturn associated things like depression and burnout, and, kind of being a grumpy old person type vibe. So Saturn is also associated with the basic structure of our life, which is really interesting because you might not necessarily jibe with the sign that your Saturn is in, but it would behoove you to understand it because it does have a lot to do with what's going to, the structure of your life that's going to allow for harmony. So the house, the sign, and then the aspects to other planets in your birth chart by Saturn can give you an idea of how this may play out. So just a quick example, I have Saturn in Taurus in the 7th house, and I'm still tinkering with the structure of my life. And I think, partially that's because I didn't pay attention to astrology for many, many years. And the other astrological explanation, I think, when I try to analyze my chart objectively, is just there are some harsh aspects with Saturn. It's doing a lot in my chart. It's squaring my sun and Mars, and it's opposing my Neptune. But if I were to kind of take those away and simplify it, I would just say that in order to live out my highest potential, I would need secure one-on-one relationships. And that's because Taurus is really about that stability and that security, especially of resources. And then the one-to-one relationships are seventh house ruled. And then those would have to just be kind of present to serve as a foundation for my son's ego purpose, which is creative self-expression. So the way I kind of interpret this so far in my life is that, Saturn, by putting that challenge up to my sun and Mars in the 10th house, which is career and vocation and reputation, legacy. So Saturn, by putting that challenge up there to the sun and Mars in the 10th, it has actually brought me close friends through my career. So Saturn sitting in the 7th, what it did is bring these one-on-one relationships. And I have these former and current colleagues that have been the most supportive for me just in all aspects of my life, not just my career, even over like other what you would think would be those one-on-one relationships that would be the most supportive, like a partner, a marriage or siblings or, a close relationship like that. It has been these current and former colleagues. So that's how I'm seeing it play out so far. And so therefore, it's not just like our Capricorn friends who have to concern themselves with all of these Saturnian concepts. And aside from kind of looking at your natal chart and assessing that sign and house and aspects to other planets, you may have heard the term Saturn return. And and I know it's in a lot of popular culture and songs and things like that. But that is when Saturn returns to the same degree on the zodiac wheel as when you were born. And so as we learned in the astronomy portion, the orbit is 29 years. And so it happens, approximately every 29 years. However, we may feel Saturn checking in with us when it is at that square, which would be 90 degrees, or an opposition, which is 180 degrees in aspect to our natal Saturn, or even just when it is hanging out, inside certain houses, and aspecting other planets. So, for example, right now, Saturn is in Pisces, and so that is my 5th house of creative self-expression and play and all of those things. And I've definitely felt this pressure to actually put some structure around, my enjoyment of things, and remembering that is something I need to actually schedule in, and Saturn, being time, that makes sense. And so now, maybe would be a good time to just interject one of the teachings of Jeffrey Wolf Green, and that is, again, the lineage that I'm learning in the Jeffrey Wolf Green School of Evolutionary Astrology. If you're interested in evolutionary astrology, I'll plop this in real quick. So what that says is that individuals who were born with Saturn in retrograde, and remember, because it spends quite a bit of time each year in retrograde, that ends up being a little bit more than a third of the population. Those individuals will be driven to question authority and the consensus norm. So they would tend to rebel in order to create their own authority. So they don't want daddy telling them what to do. They want to create their own authority, and then they would integrate back into society in a way that honors what they feel is their authentic individuality. So keep that in mind too if you're interested in evolutionary astrology. But the basics, if you have a Saturn return coming up, and know that like most people feel its energy for about a year or two around that exact point of the Saturn return, or even the entire time that Saturn is in the sign it was in your birth. And or if you just have an aspect to a sensitive spot in your birth chart that Saturn is like sitting there making, here are some of the things to consider. And just know that, there are these nuances around these things, and they would change depending on things such as which sign, Saturn happens to be in, and, where your Saturn is sitting, and the individual aspects and things. But I'll try to give some examples later using Saturn's current sign, Pisces. So remember, Saturn was the god of time. So he wants to know that you are not wasting yours. And the standard will always have the long game in mind. In other words, are you spending time on activities that will get you closer to your long-term goals? And kind of worse, do you have no goals in mind? Are you just kind of floating along and letting life live you? And it doesn't have to be a big goal or even the perfect goal. Sometimes just putting in an effort, even if it teaches you that you don't want that goal, is helpful, because that won't have been a waste of time. You will have learned something. And with Saturn and Pisces, we keep all of those Saturn attributes, but then we layer Pisces' way of being over it. So at first, this seems a bit weird because Pisces is about boundarylessness. It's really slippery, like those two fish in the glyph. Like you try to pick it up and it just slips away. And it's also about Neptunian types of things like dreams and mysticism, forms of escapism and hidden things. It can be so like out there in dreamland that you don't even see it. So how might we just plop those Saturn attributes amid these concepts? It seems to be about finding structural integrity in all of those things that have to do with the unseen realms. So how can you put definition and boundaries in those areas? And if we were simply floating along in Pisces water, completely detached from reality, we might be feeling a jolt into reality right now. That's kind of tough to overlook. And again, it's the long term. So it's not going to be like a Uranus transit where something like unexpected happens and you lose your job or you break your leg or whatever. Saturn is a little more subtle than that, but it's and especially being in Pisces. So you may really just, a perfect Pisces thing would be like to sit down and like meditate over these things and what little tweaks or big tweaks you might be asked to make right now. And I wanted to give just a little bit of a Saturn story. So I chose Albert Einstein, and I thought he might be an interesting example, well, for many reasons, but he has his sun in Pisces. And so what I read is that when he was young, he excelled in all of the tasks and subjects which interested him, and then he ignored the rest. So he then dropped out of high school, but he managed to like finesse a high school diploma. And by the way, he was born in Germany, and then he ended up studying in Switzerland. And teachers either recognized him as brilliant or they just never saw him. So that's like a, Pisces 12th house kind of thing. Oh, I think his sun was in the 12th house too. So, they never seeing him would make sense there. So in 1901, when he was 22, about a year after graduating with his college degree, Saturn was conjunct his descendant. So that would be that cusp between the 6th and the 7th house. So kind of like before you're going to launch into the world of other people. So it was conjunct with his descendant, and Uranus was in opposition to his natal moon. And he was getting desperate for a job. He had gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and she was Serbian, and because of like he wasn't marrying her, and she had to go back home to Serbia, but he really wanted her to come back and marry him. But he was already having these kind of Saturn career aspirations kind of hanging over his head, and he had applied for Swiss citizenship, and it was kind of like this against all odds thing that he was actually approved, because they weren't approving a lot of new citizens at the time with his particular background. So he was not only given that citizenship, but also a job in the Swiss patent office that wouldn't start for another year. So meanwhile, he's, again, there's a lot of things written about this, but he left, he kind of left his girlfriend to have the baby in Serbia, and, didn't bring them over. And so I'll mention a little bit about that baby in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. So he was doing this more Saturn thing, working in the patent office. Personal life's kind of a mess. He was also, as he was in his career, he was, known to be this womanizer, even after he brought that woman from Serbia over to get married. And it wasn't until Saturn crossed his midheaven that he started getting attention from the scientific community. Okay, so he had already been kind of sacrificing, you might say, his personal life, because he was concerned about his reputation. So he didn't marry her right away. He didn't admit to fathering this child, etc. And Saturn can be about, like, what are we willing to sacrifice to reach this goal of having a legacy. And so anyway, when Saturn crossed his midheaven and he started getting attention, then a couple years later, when he actually had his full Saturn return, things really started picking up. And he got a job first at the University of Bern, and then a full professorship at the University of Zurich. And when Saturn crossed his ascendant in 1915, that's when he published his general theory of relativity. But his first marriage also ended. So I just point this out because sometimes there are difficult choices too that Saturn asks of us. So I think it's good to go into those consciously. And clearly, for our benefit, Albert Einstein, he did kind of put everything into his career. But it would take until the total solar eclipse in 1919 that English scientists were able to test his theory about the relationship between gravity and light. And by December of that year, as Saturn reached his Imam Celi, so the icy or undersky, that's the cusp of your fourth house, he became the most famous scientist in the world then, and he would receive the Nobel Prize. So you can see in that story that, both his Saturn return, but also when Saturn was aspecting those important angles that we all have in our chart, these career and reputation and legacy things happened. And I said I'd come back to the child. And it's kind of, at least what I saw, it was unclear as to what happened to that child. Again, he was 22 when he fathered that child. And that in and of itself is kind of this Saturnian theme of not doing right by his child. So the other thing is that his sun, Mercury, and Saturn are all really close together. So this also shows how, each chart is unique, and there will be these confounding factors. You can't ever look at things in isolation. And then, I just was also thinking about those things that we all have to keep in mind about the choices, and that we only have a finite amount of time on this earth. And sometimes we have to prioritize, and we may have those periods in our life where things are just not in harmony because of that decision to prioritize certain things. Okay, that may have been a little heavier than I wanted, but I hope it was interesting. And this may be a little more useful. So what I thought I would do is look at Saturn's energy in each of the 12 houses. So you can think of this as how, where Saturn is in your birth chart, but also right now you can go ahead and download your birth chart for free if you don't have one yet. And there are those different online sites like astro.com or AstroSeek, or the different apps for your phone. And those can show you which house Saturn is in. And then what you can also do is see which house Pisces is sitting over. And so, for example, I mentioned I can look at my chart and I see that Pisces is in my 5th house. So I know that right now Saturn's influencing those, but you may have Pisces in your 1st house, or your 5th, whatever, your 6th or 8th. And so that's what you'll want to do now, is just kind of keep in mind these themes. And these come from Steven Forrest, who is an amazing astrologer, and has written many books, which I encourage you to get if you're like beginning to intermediate, but even advanced people who I talk to, they reference his books all the time. And he writes in a really storytelling kind of way that is fun. Okay, so when Saturn is outside or in your 1st house, all of those Saturn themes are aimed at you individually as a person. How are you working toward self-mastery, toward that main goal in life, especially the goal that will create your legacy? 2nd house, focus on securing or arranging personal resources to allow you to feel secure. And then, as you continue to place effort towards your goal in life, it's kind of evaluating these resources. And that may mean learning to live below your means, just so you have that secure cushion and a foundation. And then for the 3rd house, this could be a time when you find your curiosity leads you to something that is going to be supportive for your life's structure or goals. And it could be through these 3rd house things of community or your network of friends or siblings. And just in general, that's a time when you don't want to be stuck inside your home. You want to kind of get out and be open. And the 4th house, the focus here is on knowing, supporting, and appreciating your foundation. So whether it's your ancestry or your physical home or the spiritual practices that make you feel you have a home within yourself. And the 5th house, just again, like for me going through this right now, think of it as structured recess. So it may have been all work and no play, and it's time to examine that. And as you may be stifling your inner child, and that's not ultimately sustainable. Then the 6th house, again, that's the house of routines and your kind of daily tasks. So just beware of busy work, and it's an opportunity to develop discernment and to tweak the structure of your daily life for either for your own longevity or in order to achieve your goals. Like, are you still doing tasks that you were doing 10 years ago, and why? Like, you should have delegated those. So you may find yourself in a mentorship position, or a mentor may show up to you in this time. And for the seventh house, this is a time period when a serious objective look at your close personal relationships is warranted. How have you been showing up? And how have they, like when you're thinking about responsibility and carrying the weight, and it's just time to stop projecting and do the work that's called for. Then the eighth house is, the focus here is on your psychological structure. So is it secure, or is it more inner work needed so that you don't get sucked into unnecessary dramas in life, which can be eighth house things? And just kind of set yourself up for a peaceful existence, like both inside and outside of yourself. In the ninth house, you may feel called to expand your horizons. So whether that is through travel or through mental or spiritual endeavors, and if you've been focusing too much on the practical, this may be an opportunity for you to question the philosophy that guides your purpose. And for the 10th house, your chosen vocation may feel exposed here. So if you are in flow with your soul, your relationships, and your community, additional responsibilities may come your way when Saturn is kind of sitting there in your 10th by transit. And if not, it's a reminder that there is work to be done to pave the way. And then for the 11th house, this is when groups come into play. So how do those groups you associate with fit into the structure and the trajectory of your life? Remember thinking of that finite time we have here. And it's time to revisit how they are or are not serving you and vice versa. And yeah, just asking that question, like, where do you want to be in 10 years' time? More of the same or dramatically different? And then the 12th house, this is where maybe deep inquiries into faith may arise here. I don't know. They may be arousing. But what do you believe in and why? And then how does your life fit into the universe? So this is kind of like, time to get serious here and think about that time component and the fact that while each life can be very impactful, we are also connected to everything else. So we're also small at the same time. So some themes might challenge you with like how you face loss or isolation. And with that, I will just say, after I've recorded this, I can kind of see that, Gemini sits over my 8th house. So I am kind of deep in those maybe darker contemplations. But I didn't mean to be a downer because I do think that Gemini season can be like super fun. And I live in Seattle and it's just been horrible weather but it's about to change. So I expect that by next week, I will be on that sunshine wave that my Leo sun adores. So if you like this podcast, please follow it and leave a review and share it if you think anyone would benefit from this. I really would love to have more people just be fluent in astrology because it's been there for thousands of years and it's doing its thing whether we acknowledge and work with it or not. And I'll post this astro energy forecast every Friday morning. I put the audio on here as a bonus episode, but you can also go to my YouTube channel and watch that as well. And I also have an astro-focused Substack if you just want to read. And I'll put the links in the show notes, as well as how you can work with me. You can just go to my website, marialuz.online. And as always, the code ASTROHIP is good for 20% off your first service of any type. And you are now empowered to become consciously curious about Saturn. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.